A very good afternoon to all of you. We, Bhumika Karmani and Chaitanya Girish Bansal, welcome you to the first plenary session of 24th Nirma International Conference on Management 2021.
We request that your mics are to be remain muted and all the questions regarding the session will be addressed at the end of the session. We request all of you to post your questions in the chat box. Before we begin, we would like to thank our partner sponsors ONGC for their support, and we will now be showcasing their corporate video.
India, one of the largest economies and among the biggest energy consumer nations. Its appetite for energy is growing at pace with its strong growth trajectory. This fast-paced development also means that a responsible nation contributes sustainably to the rise of a healthier, prosperous Indian society. ONGC, since its inception in 1956, has made pioneering endeavors to realize the vision of a proud, self-sufficient, prosperous nation by providing affordable energy. Oil and Natural Gas Commission, constituted by the Government of India to delve into the vast Indian geological landscape, successfully explored the Earth's treasures in arid deserts, dense forests and the deep blue oceans around the Indian peninsula, and scripted India's hydrocarbon saga. The commission, which transformed later into a crown jewel among the country's public sectors. The Maharatna, Oil and Natural Gas Corporation, continues to lead and set new benchmarks and forges ahead on its mission of energy independence, the main theme of the growth story of India. Breaking the century-old myth at the very early days of its foundation that no significant oil could ever be found in India, today ONGC is successfully producing oil and gas from Mehsana, Cambay, Ankleshwar in Gujarat, Krishna, Godavari and Kaveri basins in the south, to Assam and Tripura in the east. Of course, from Mumbai High, the biggest discovery made in 1974, which brought India prominently on the oil and gas map of the world. And later significant discoveries of Hira, Neelam and Ratna fields in western waters. And the Baseen field discovery in the western offshore, which remains thus far the largest gas field of India. Today we move further and deeper, adopting latest innovations of deep-sea technologies for breaking the challenges of depth, high temperature and high pressure to bring production from new gas discoveries of eastern offshore in Bay of Bengal and in Kutch offshore. Breaking the technological barriers with the adoption of the latest innovations in oil and gas engineering and a focused and motivated talent pool, ONGC continues to be a global leader in the E&P sector and one of the most valued Indian national energy companies. An equal opportunity employer, ONGC is among the most admired organizations of the country and among the best places to work. Every employee is duty-bound and committed to create a healthy, safe and friendly work culture for all. ONGC management takes pride in ensuring that its work environment and facilities are motivationally inspiring for every section of the employees. For ONGC, safety is paramount over any operation. Its safety practices have been globally accepted among the best and have routinely been bringing glorious recognitions. Concerns for protecting the earth and the environment are important factors for all business and operational decisions. Our endeavors and the goals for making alternate energy sources part of our future business are hallmarks of our vision for the next 20 years. In recognition of its role as a responsible corporate leader, ONGC's social outreach initiatives have made a positive, tangible difference to the society it engages with, and its efforts are emulated and quoted for inspiration widely. Aspiring to establish its presence in the entire hydrocarbon value chain, ONGC has today created a niche for itself in not just oil and gas, but refining, LNG, petrochemicals and power. ONGC Videsh Limited, the country's largest international oil and gas company, having widespread global participation in oil and gas business, has been contributing significantly to the revenue growth of ONGC. Almost 7 decades of experience, strong fundamentals, dependable and trained human resource of unparalleled competence has led ONGC to achieve its vision of being a largely self-sufficient Indian conglomerate. Relentlessly marching ahead with breakthroughs that fuel our journey to realize the vision of a prosperous India.
Welcome once again to the first plenary session of NICOM 2021. The chair for the session is Professor Diana Basil.
The keynote speakers for the session are Dr. Taran Patel and Dr. Anjan Bhowmick, who will brief us on contemporary dialogues in human resource management.
Professor Diana Basil, the chair for the session, is a professor at Asian Institute of Management, New Zealand, and has been for more than 4 years. She did her early education from the University of Texas at Dallas and Oklahoma State University, while her higher education is completed from the University of Texas at Arlington, which is a college of business administration. We welcome you, ma'am. We now request Professor Diana Basil to take over the session.
Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for inviting me for my first online conference here at Nirma's International Conference in Management. Thank you, Hardik, for having me as your moderator for this plenary session. And we'll go ahead and start our plenary session. Let me introduce our speaker, our first speaker, Professor Taran Patel. Taran is an associate professor with Grenoble Ecole de Management in France, and she's teaching courses on research methods and international management, particularly topics related to culture and diversity. She's also a mother to a 4-year-old child, and her research program includes the themes around leadership effectiveness, negative leadership, and female leadership and gender issues. Today, Taran will talk to us about contemporary discourses on leadership. Taran, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tina. Thank you, Hardik Bhai, for having me, and thank you all for being present for this session. It gives me great pleasure to talk to you today because I'm based in France and I don't get to interact with Indian colleagues as much as I would like. It's freezing out here in Grenoble. My windows are shut, but it's covered with snow all over the place. So it's a nice warm feeling to be able to connect with India and the Indian weather. Without wasting any more of your time, I'm going to share my slides with you, and then I'll talk you through the slides. I'd be happy to share the slides with anyone who's interested. For now, I'll just walk you quickly over through the slides and the content of my presentation, but I'd be happy to elaborate more in the question answer sessions once we have the time for that after Anjan's presentation. So I'm going to move on to my slides. And here we are. Perfect. Okay. The topic I've chosen to share with you today on is contemporary discourses on leadership and followership. When I started preparing the slides, I was thinking more about leadership, and then I felt it very important to talk about followership because in my understanding at least, there cannot be leadership without followership. So I'm going to elaborate on that in the second half of my presentation. As Dina has already said, I hold my PhD in International Business Studies from the Open University of Milton Keynes in the UK, and I was supervised for my PhD by Dr. Steve Rayner, who's a Nobel Peace Prize winner from the University of Oxford. Unfortunately, he passed away last year in January, on the 17th of January, actually, from cancer. I did my postdoctoral work at the University of Oxford as well, and so a lot of my initial publications are influenced by what we call the social anthropology school, or transactional school of social anthropology, really, and cultural studies in international business. As Dina has already said, I work in the area of leadership, followership, leadership effectiveness, and more recently, I've become more and more intrigued by female leadership, and my interest has reverted back to India when it comes to women. So one of my latest papers has been accepted for publication in a journal called Organization, which is a well-reputed journal of international recognition. Most of my other publications are in Journal of Business Ethics, Journal of Organizational Change Management, and European Management Review. And my teaching areas are, as Dina has already explained, business ethics, research methodology, leadership studies, cultural diversity. Since leadership is part of the topic that I want to discuss with you today, I thought it important to begin by defining the conventional understanding on leadership, which states that leadership is the ability to influence a group towards achieving a certain goal. And in line with this definition, obviously, leadership is a group phenomenon because it involves followers. It involves a certain degree of influence and persuasion. Oftentimes, leadership has to do with hierarchy. In other words, there are leaders at a certain position and followers at a lower position. And that is the conventional understanding of leadership. Leadership is generally about goal-directed behavior. It leads followers toward a specific goal. Rather than dwell upon the conventional understanding on leadership, I wanted to share with you some of the new and upcoming topics in leadership in the recent decades. And I decided to divide them into two groups, the good and the bad and the ugly. And obviously, those of you who are from my generation recognize where that's coming from. That's a famous Clint Eastwood movie called The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. But I'm sure the younger audiences do not relate to it. But you guys can go on YouTube and check it out. There is a movie by Clint Eastwood, quite a famous one, actually. So I'll begin with the good part. So one of the concepts that has become very prominent in recent times is mindful leadership. And those of you who come from a Buddhist or a Hindu background, the term mindful or mindfulness should not be new to you. What is new, though, is that the Western world is becoming very focused on mindfulness. And especially in the northern part of Europe, the notion of mindful leadership is catching on in a big way. Now, mindfulness implies being present, experiencing the present moment without contemplation of the past or worries about the future. So living in the present moment, but not for the present moment. Not confuse the two. And mindful leadership then is about those leaders who think not just about their gains or about their goals or their accomplishments, but they think about their connection with people around them and how those people around them can also achieve their own objectives. So it is about being sensitive to others around you and also being sensitive to the environment, which involves sensitivity towards nature, appreciation of the environment, recognizing the interrelations that we have, or the interdependence that we have between different stakeholders in our environment. The notion that we don't exist for ourselves and by ourselves, but that we are connected with others around ourselves. The notion of liberating leadership is also catching on. This is not very new, but it is nonetheless becoming more and more popular now. As the name implies, liberating leadership is about giving the space to others, giving them the freedom to act on their own and learn through their own experiences. And as you can well imagine, this involves a certain degree of egalitarianism. The conventional notion of leadership does not lend itself very easily to liberating leadership because the conventional notion involves a certain degree of hierarchy and a division of power, while liberating leadership involves undermining these differences and getting people to believe in themselves and their own capacities rather than having to seek input from their hierarchical superiors at every step. Humanistic leadership is all about human dignity and ethics. Now, humanistic leadership is not about having a CSR department separately in your company. It's about integrating ethical reflections in everything that we do, in our day-to-day work, in our day-to-day interactions with our different stakeholders. It is about repositioning businesses in service of humanity and not just for profit making. So this requires a very, very different mindset than what we have been seeing in leadership, both in the corporate world as well as in the socio-political world, with regards to the focus on self-interest and self-gain, if you will. And finally, resonant leadership, or just before finally, resonant leadership. The term resonance implies being in harmony with the other, being in tune with the other. And therefore, resonant leadership is all about recognizing the significance of the other. It is all about using emotional intelligence and cultural intelligence to be in harmony with the other and to bring out the best value from others by building a positive, healthy, and vibrant relationship. And as I said, finally, servant leadership, which is somewhat of a known term. This is not entirely new. Servant leadership involves giving importance to the other, considering the position of leadership not as a privilege, but as an opportunity to serve others, understanding the priorities of others and helping them achieve their priorities. So helping subordinates grow and succeed. And I think this is very, very important because organizations sometimes tend to overemphasize their own objectives, undermining in the process their employees' need for growth and development. And when that happens, they are not serving their employees, they're serving just their own interests. And that does not lead to sustainable or viable relations on the long term. So this is about the good, but leadership is not always good. There's an ugly side to leadership, there's also a bad side to leadership. It's a question of degrees, right? So I'd like to begin with emphasizing the importance of negative leadership. Why should we focus on negative leadership? It's important to focus on negative leadership or understand negative leadership rather than brushing it under the carpet, because the impact of negative leadership is far more stronger than the impact of positive leadership. Positivity is something we expect, we want to see in others. And so when somebody is positive towards us, we take it in a stride. But when somebody behaves negatively, the impact of that is much more significant than the impact of positive behavior. Therefore, we cannot undermine negative leadership. And to begin with, a lesser degree of negative leadership could be termed as dysfunctional leadership. What is dysfunctional leadership? Something we see all around us. If you have been following the recent events in the media, well, more precisely in the US, there's a lot of dysfunctionality in the leadership out there right now, in the present times. Dysfunctional leaders are focused on their personal gains, and their tactic is to generate fear, to use fear in a non-violent way without surpassing legal limits, but to serve their own interest, exploiting others through fear to gain what they want. What is interesting is that some of these leaders, dysfunctional leaders, despite using these kinds of tactics, using fear and other negative tactics, they manage to maintain positive impressions and positive relations with other key stakeholders. There are many people who will support them, whether that's in the corporate context or in the political world. They have support because they do have an appeal with certain members of certain segments of the population, if you will. One step higher then, one degree more significant, is toxic leadership. I say significant in terms of the means or methods used by these leaders to get what they want. Toxic leaders are individuals who use an extreme amount of fear, extreme amount of stress. They may even engage in bullying or harassment to get what they want. So they go beyond the normal ways of functioning. They go off the deep end, as Keats de Vries would say. They are often termed as internal terrorists or psychoterrorists or organizational terrorists. And here you have examples of people who intimidate others, who engage in sexual harassment or moral harassment to gain what they want. So this is really the limits, if you will, of what is legal, what is ethical, and what is decent behavior in the workplace. And once again, you have several examples of toxic leadership, both from the political world as well as from the corporate world. But the question that we must consider also is what kind of followership allows this kind of leadership to sustain itself? Why do such leaders exist? Whether that's the political world or the corporate world, how is it that they come into existence and they actually survive for a period of time at least? So there are different kinds of followerships that allow such leaderships to flourish. You may have benign followers. Benign followers are people whom you would refer to as sheep. They are people who follow without questioning. Because somebody is a designated leader, challenge them, you don't challenge their actions. Those followers would be termed as benign followers. And then you have the leader's entourage who actively supports the leader. They are the alter ego of the leader. They confirm the leader's approach because they agree with it. And then you have the malevolent followers who don't necessarily agree with the leader, but they might pretend to agree because they themselves are interested in those leadership positions. So they are hoping to exploit their positive impression, their seemingly positive impression with the leader in order to attain something for themselves on the long run. So when you think about toxic leadership around you, whether that's political or in companies, please ask yourselves what kind of followership exists in that context. Why is it that these toxic leaders emerge in that context, and how is it that they sustain themselves? what does that say about followers? Because surely these leaders could not exist without the support of followers. There's also aversive leadership, which uses, again, coercive power, but again, in a less explicit way. The coercion would be verbal rather than physical. It would be passive rather than active, indirect rather than direct, and subtle rather than overt. So we are talking about a hidden form of coercion, not very, very explicit. And then despotic leadership, and as the name implies, despotic leadership, a little bit like narcissistic leadership, is about self-interest. It is about gaining what leaders want and distorting the resources, distorting the goals of the organization for self-interest. Laissez-faire leadership is essentially an absence of leadership. Now, please don't confuse this with empowerment. Empowerment is where you consciously give power to the others so that they may flourish in their own learning and growth. Laissez-faire leadership, on the other hand, is a total absence of leadership because you're being irresponsible as a leader. You're not doing what is expected of you as a leader, and therefore not carrying out the leadership role that has been assigned to you. There are several consequences of negative leadership at the individual level as well as at the organizational level, but I'm going to skip that part in the interest of saving some time. I am happy to elaborate on those points later if required. I would like to dedicate the next few minutes to the notion of, or the concept of followership, if you will. Now, generally speaking, followership is ignored. We pay attention to leadership, but we ignore followership. And this is kind of contradictory with what we are seeing in contemporary times. In recent times, we've seen that there have been a lot of successful movements that have been led by followers, by people who did not hold any position of power, except that they had a conviction about something being right or wrong. And here you have the example of Greta Thunberg, who, despite being such a young person, has managed to mobilize people around the topic of climate change and the interest of the environment. We have also many examples from historical references. We have, well, the recent example of the Arab Spring, but also historical examples of the struggle to end apartheid in South Africa, or the Indian struggle for independence from the British, and so on and so forth. We've got many examples where the common people made a difference. They led movements. They became leaders through their actions. So followers, in my understanding, or followership in my understanding, is not simply the flip side of leadership. It is much more than that. But there are two schools on followership. One is where followership is simply a role that you play. Followership is based on your hierarchical designation. So somebody is a leader and therefore somebody is a follower. That is one notion of followership. But what I subscribe to is a social constructivist approach to followership, which means that followership is constructed as leadership is constructed. And followership and leadership are in fact constructed together through social interactions. So that is a school of thought that I support in my research, and I'll explain that to you. So the role theory approach essentially talks about the hierarchy, followership and leadership. And the approach, on the other hand, talks about co-creation of leadership and followership, a simultaneous co-creation, because if you do not have leadership, you cannot have followership. But if you do not have followership, there can be no leader either. So the notion that leadership cannot exist without followership. And one or two frameworks just to explain what followership means. One framework that I like a lot is that by Barbara Kellerman. And for students who are interested in this topic, you can find detailed videos of Barbara Kellerman on this framework on YouTube, explaining much better than what I can in the few minutes allocated to me. And what is interesting about Barbara Kellerman's approach is that she defines followership by the degree of engagement. And engagement essentially involves the power to influence. If I'm engaged in something, I have a conviction about something, I can influence people through my own convictions. So engagement is power. And she identifies a sort of a ranking of followership based on the degree of engagement. So there are isolates, bystanders, participants, activists, and diehards. Again, based on different degrees of engagement. Isolates just watch. They are disengaged. So they're not interested in the topic being discussed. They're not interested in bringing about change. Bystanders observe but do not participate. Participants are involved to a certain extent, as the name implies. Activists feel strongly about the topic at hand and they act on their convictions. And then you have diehards, deeply committed and prepared to die for their causes. And on the previous slide, I give you an example just from my reading of popular media of Irena Sendler, who recently passed away. In fact, she was a simple nurse at the time of the Second World War, and she helped save the lives of over 1,000 Jewish children, despite being captured by the Gestapo and despite being under observation and despite being put in prison. She only escaped the Gestapo by bribing somebody and finding her way out of prison. But she, in the process, in her work as a nurse, came across many Jewish children who were being persecuted just because of their faith. So what she did is she kidnapped those children and shipped them out of the country and put them with other families. And it was only several years later that when these children grew up and collectively decided to honor Irina Sendler, that they traced her back and she was publicly honored for her work. So these are the kind of people who are willing to die for their causes, for their convictions. And she was a simple nurse. She had no leadership position. There was nothing she could influence through her position or power. And yet she saved their lives. She had an impact on more than 1,000 children at that point in time. So I like this framework because it shows that engagement is power. Through engagement, through conviction, we can bring about a change. And then from the social constructivist view, I wanted to talk about Derues and Ashford's understanding of leadership and followership. And they talk about two key terms, very simple to understand: claiming and granting. Claiming occurs when an individual ascertains an identity, either as a leader or a follower. So I may come to you and claim to be your follower, but I can only become your follower when you grant me that followership, when you accept the leadership. So that is granting followership to me and accepting the identity of a leader in support of my followership. But unless I claim followership, you cannot be my leader. And unless you grant me your leadership, I cannot be your follower. So there are these two concomitant processes, if you will, or simultaneous processes of claiming and granting that need to occur for leadership and followership to emerge. It happens that leadership and followership are not constructed as well. Because if I claim to be your leader and you reject me, then I cannot be your leader. If you don't grant me that leadership, I cannot be your leader. So leadership is requested, really, and it has to be granted. Position by itself does not bring leadership. It might bring you positional power, but it might not bring you leadership in the true sense of the term. And on the other hand, followership cannot be granted unless the leaders accept you as followers. So these are co-constructed processes, therefore, and the role of the follower therefore not be undermined, because without followership, there cannot be the construction of leadership. I would like to conclude my presentation by bringing all of this together. How does this interact with one another? So, certain followership characteristics, followership traits, for example, Machiavellianism, their followers' ability to be political. Followers can be very political. It's not just leaders who are political. Followers' motivation, are they motivated by power themselves? Are they motivated to lead? Do they want to become leaders in the future? Followers' perceptions, their own implicit followership theories, their own implicit leadership theories, their idea of leadership, the romance of leadership, all of this is part of their characteristics. So followerships have varied characteristics in the same way as leaders have varied characteristics. Leaders might have an attitude towards power. They might want to create a dependence on themselves among followers, or they might want to empower their followers. They might have a certain affect. They might have a state or a trait affect of always being positive or always being negative, or sometimes being positive and sometimes being negative. They also have their own perceptions, their implicit followership theories, their implicit leadership theories, their own degree of support, the degree of support they perceive from their followers. So all of these are leadership characteristics. And you also have followers and leadership behaviors. Followers might choose to behave in a certain way. They might be obedient or they might be resistant. They might choose to voice their dissent, or they might choose to change things by being proactive. In the same way, leaders might also choose to behave in certain ways, irrespective of their innate characteristics. They may choose to be democratic, or they may choose autocratic. They may choose to give feedback or retain feedback. They may choose to focus on the development of followers or not. And therefore, all the characteristics and all the behaviors of leaders and followers interact with one another on an ongoing basis, eventually to produce at a variety of levels. There could be impacts on individual followers. For instance, the kind of interaction you have with your leader could make you an informal leader yourself as a follower. It might motivate you to take on some informal leadership. It might make you more effective in your work. It might contribute to your potential and organizational advancement. For the leaders also, there is an impact of all of these interactions with followers. Leaders might feel energized or they might feel derailed. Leaders might gain support, they might move towards their objectives, or they might lose support and not be able to achieve their objectives. There's also an impact of the interaction between leaders and followers on the relationship between leaders and followers. Does that contribute to trust? Does that improve the relationship between leaders and followers? And finally, the outcome is also at the level of organizational processes. Will an organization behave in an ethical fashion? Will it be open to change? Will it embrace change or will it resist change? So to conclude then, there are several factors that interact. There are followers' characteristics, followers' behaviors, leaders' characteristics, leaders' behaviors. And all of these interact to produce outcomes at a variety of different levels for organizations. At the level of followers, at the level of leaders, at the level of their relationship, and at the level of the entire organization. And therefore, organizational outcomes are the outcome or are the result of dynamic interactions between leaders and followers, characteristics and behaviors, but also the organizational climate, the context within the organization. And therefore, our tendency, our natural tendency to always point fingers at leaders for something that goes wrong or something that goes right, I think is too simplistic. It is too delimiting. We need to move away from this excessive focus on leadership and start looking at reality as being a more balanced interaction between leaders, followers, and the context. So I hope I have not overshot.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Taran. And I think you just burst all of our rose-colored glasses when it comes to leadership by presenting us with the bad and the ugly side. But I think, like you said, we really need to understand it in its totality. And I'm sure in your HR classes, your professors would always kind of allude to the fact that a person joins an organization but leaves because of a boss, right? I mean, and really that's the kind of, thought that goes through my mind as I listen to Taran talk about this different types of leadership. So hopefully you'll have more questions for Taran when we go through the Q&A section. And let me go ahead and introduce our next presenter, Professor Anjan Bhowmick, who is a faculty instructor at the Cornell University in the US, teaching leadership and HR courses to a diverse set of students across the globe. Anjan is passionate about creating pathways to connect and unleash individuals and teams to make an unexpected and sustainable positive impact on their companies, communities, and societies at large. Today, he will talk to us about what are the current leadership expectations around building organizational capability as a value-creating proposition. Anjan, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Dinah. Thank you for that introduction. And Taran, thank you for this very, very enlightening presentation. I gained a lot and I learned a lot. So thank you, Professor Hardik. Thank you for the Nirma Institute for giving me this opportunity to share some of the thoughts around leadership. And I like the word discourse because it's actually conversations, right? So I think one of the things that the theme that you'll find in both maybe Taran's presentation and my presentation would be conversation. So it's not about takeaways, it's about conversations. So with that note, I'm going to jump in. How much time do I have, Diana? Do I have about 10 minutes, 15 minutes? I'll just so that I'll figure out how to position my slides.
Yeah, I think you can have 15 minutes and then I think they'll leave us plenty of time for the Q&A.
Super. Okay, thank you for that. So I'm sharing my screen. All right, great. So one of the things that I'm going to spend time on is a lot of we're looking at is around expectations of building organization capabilities. And why organization capabilities is because, I mean, when you're going to the drawing board around relooking at organization design, fundamentally theory and structure from the, if you look at design, and within design, there is, what elements of structures and configurations you will have. The fundamental premise that leaders are spending time in the boardroom is around how do I rebalance organization capabilities. There is discussion around supply chain. There is discussion around, how do I reorient my current supply chain? How do I reorient my current sales organization, sales structures? And COVID has fundamentally given a lot of impetus and probably the, thinking at the speed of light. Correct. So, so the speed of those discussions are bringing up, and why it's important to give you a flavor here is important, because the leaders are actually discussing certain nodals. So when you walk out of your college, you would find these discussions coming on, and my attempt here is to provide you with a quick summary as to what are those nodes of discussions that's happening. Okay, so the discussion is very, very key. But before I jump into that, I just want to give you a brief outlook around, what is this thing called enterprise capability, and what's the fundamental genesis of what we call as enterprise capability. And it has its eminence on what we call, as I think you guys have already talked about and probably studied about, is in the concept of scientific management and human resource management, or human resource movements, right? And when I say that, I mean that there are different ways in which these two schools of thought look at capability. Okay. And if you're looking at scientific management, essentially, and way back in 1900s, when you're looking at that, you see that there were no discussion on people, there were no discussion on human affairs, there were no discussions on attitude, there were no discussions on emotions, right? And that's what Frederick Taylor talked about, right? You are here to produce or manage or maximize efficiency and production. We would keep the concept around human affairs and emotions somewhere at the side. And therefore, the element or the opportunity for discussions on enterprise capability was not too open. So there were not too much scope around trying to see where is it that I'm going to fit in this whole, beast called enterprise capability, right? And that went on until 1930, so to speak, right? And that got overturned by, and I think all of you must have talked about, seen the fundamental knowledge of Elton Mayo's work, where he said, hey, when you're looking at success in organizations, we are not only talking about efficiency of production, but you should look at what we call as human affairs, which is personal growth and development. And that's where the discussions around human development started kicking in, right? And of course, that got propagated by authors and scientists way back in 1930. Chester talked about in his book and his work on functions of executives on how do I look at, so the first aspect of attitudes got propounded in 1930s. The word attitude in the management term got coined in by Chester's work on human behavior and executives. There's a lot of study. Read these up. I'm going to send this presentation, not an issue. Read these up around, there's a lot of work around Ohio study. There's a Michigan school study. It goes right up to 1960, where a lot of work around the human aspect of leadership started developing. So the premise that leaders talked about people was not right until the 1930s. They only talked about processes and technology. It only changed the positioning, whilst some of the authors started very, very strongly propagating some of the elements of what we call as personal growth and development. And pretty much when we talk about development, where the narrative around enterprise capabilities started building up, right? So the reason I'm sharing this slide is to probably give you a perspective around how those conversations got changed from a technical to a much more technical plus human aspects, right? So that was something I thought was very fascinating. The other interesting piece which came in was the aspect on whilst those conversations were going on, leaders started being, getting reliant on what we call enterprise capability. They're starting to figure out, hey, there was an intrinsic value we ignored until the 1930s. What is this beast? Let's know a little more about it, right? And therefore, if you see literature around, even literature, practitioner literature or research literature, the concept of enterprise capability is relatively new. Okay, it's not something that got talked about even in the 1960s or even in the 1970s. It was somewhere in 1995s or the later 90s that this concept of enterprise capability, what do we do with it? Do we need a standardized follower concept? So all of that got, it's fairly new. And I think that's critical because now that we look back, we think one of the key drivers of enterprise success is actually building that whole work around capability. So when you're looking at a strategy framework, you look up any strategy framework, it basically gives you 4 questions or 5 questions: how to play, where to win, what capabilities you have, and what processes and systems would you like to adopt. So if you answer those 4 questions, you possibly have a strategy in place, right? And you see capabilities very, very highly embedded in the enterprise ecosystem as we talk today. And that's where the genesis has started. So it's becoming very fast paced, and enterprise capability has been talked about across firms and organizations. The limitation, although, on enterprise capability then around 1990s is that, leaders didn't know what to do with it. You go to a company and say, hey, what are some of the capabilities you require to win in the market? They'll give you 5 sets of capability, right? You go to another company and say, hey, what are those capabilities that you would require to be successful? They'll give you another set of capability, right? So we really didn't know what is this overarching enterprise capability that needs to be adhered to at a broad spectrum, right? It's nothing wrong to have customized capability, because that's fundamentally when we are talking about technical capability. But when you're actually talking about behavioral capability, there are some fundamental premises that you need to follow when we're looking at dimensions of work around capability. So multiplicity was an issue. And that's where I'm going to spend time, because you can talk each of it for the next 5 hours, but I'm going to spend a little time on the multiplicity of the dimensions, and how is it that organizations have worked on standardizing some of that. And that's the work that I'm doing. And that's my seminal work in the next couple of years, on what are those and how is it that the leaders are perceiving that, which is what I'm going to test it today in this seminar. The third one is, a lot of leaders took this thing called the strategic capability approach. So some of them took, what is the core capability? Give me 5 of them. They transform into those capabilities into a set of competencies. Competencies are nothing but a set of visible behaviors, and therefore behaviors which translates into tasks and outcomes, right? So a lot of your leaders fundamentally took this linear dimension of strategic capability approach, saying that you have these 5 capabilities, construct that into competencies, get into behaviors, get into a set of actions, and then you get an outcome. So that's one school of thought. The other school of thought is typically predominant in functional dimension, is what we know as the knowledge management approach. And they are saying, let's not get into the strategic capability. Every function has a capability, technical or behavioral. Let's decentralize it. Let's do a functional one. And that's another approach. This is just a point to elucidate that the approaches differed as we talked, right? So what are HR practitioners or business leaders or CEOs doing in terms of managing their organizations? These are the 2 things that are predominantly available in the realm of affairs in organizations. So I'm going to spend a little time on point 2, because that's exactly what I'm and the other 3 I would leave it for another way. You can read it up. I've given you some of the authors here, so you can read out and see what makes sense to you. But fundamentally, when you're looking at multiplicity of dimensions, what are they discussing? When you're looking at capabilities, a lot of leaders talk about, how did you deploy that capability? And that's a discussion happens everywhere. Okay, I'm giving you this amount of money. I've given you this amount of resources. What was the quality of deployment in terms of content, style, logistics? So that's one discussion. The other discussion which leaders make is, how was content? That is, how is the quality of technical capability or competencies that you're deploying? The other is, let's test it. So there was this whole thing around paper pencil tests, and if you remember these, those fundamental earlier schools of thought around assessing and saying, okay, let's see where they are, and then try to see what are we building over a period of time. So that's those paper pencils. On the behavioral dimensions, somewhere some inventory started getting deployed, some Cronbach's alpha got formed, some reliability tests got. So that's another way to see, okay, this is where we can test behavioral capability in some places, right? And it's predominant in some places in organizations. And the last but not the least is pretty high level. I say, hey, what's the payout of these capabilities? I'm deploying that. How do I get money back, or how do I get the value proposition out of those capabilities that I deploy? And there'll be more, right? So these are some of the things that when we read some work, these are some of the elements that comes out. It would be a mixture of two in some places. It could be one or three of them, but whatever the point in case would be. My effort here is to give you these levels of discussion. So when you go to a firm, you will find leaders discussing around quality deployment, content assessment, technical competencies is no more paper pencil. It's going to be online now. Behavioral inventory, ROIs and ROI, etc. Right? So be prepared of the fact that there would be capability output assessments happening across organizations where leaders will engage each of us on these sort of conversations, right? And therefore, that brings me to kind of give you a bit of an idea about what those conversations would probably emerge in terms of a framework. And one of the things that I would probably give you is when you're looking at the behavioral competency or the behavioral capability to build enterprise capability, what are some of the areas that leaders are looking at? And I've relied my reference on this is a great book by Phillips and Phillips. He was a follower of Kirkpatrick, but very, very interestingly went back and did something much more than what Kirkpatrick did it. So and Lewins did it. Just so read this up if you really want to know how to measure enterprise capability. What are some of those nodes? And that's a frame of reference. And this was practiced in the firm that I'm working in. And they went on to actually figure out what's this whole thing around value creation. And they said when you're measuring capability, don't measure only quantitative data. It is derived from different sources. It's not a single number. It's actually not at a particular instance of time. It's longitudinal. It's both qualitative and qualitative. So respect both the aspects of qualitative and quantitative. It has financials and non-financials. It reflects tactics and strategic, and research says both are equally important. It's not always that strategic is most important, tactical goes corner. So logistics and tactical high level is critical. And of course, as I talked about, it's not at a point of time when you're looking at capability, but a longitudinal period. And of course, uniform standards needs to be set. So my next slide is around giving you some nodes which leaders are expecting from us. And this is practiced in a lot of insurance companies, fintech companies, and now probably in consumer CPG companies, is what are some of the nodes that leaders and boardrooms are discussing, right? The first thing that you see is there are a lot of discussions around design and structure. Okay, that's the first thing that gets discussed, or at least gets prepared. And fundamentally, what are the conversations around? Conversations are around business case, who would be involved, what's the involvement of my people to build capability, what is the cost of that capability, are you satisfied with the output, who would be involved in terms of levels of management, pretty much basic in terms of some inquiries that you make. So that's an area of conversation that's getting formed up. The second area of conversation is what we call as perceived value. Now, what and mark the word perceived, it's not the value, it's the perceived value. Is that the leadership conversations are saying, how much do you think will provide value? What are some of your hypotheses in terms of providing that value? What are some of the assumptions that you'll make or modeling outputs that you'll get to say, if I deploy the capability, this is what I'll get, right? So there is this whole thing around perceived value and reactions. How relevant is it? How important is it? Is it fair? Is it motivational? Is it appropriate, etc., etc.? So that's the level of discussions that leaders are making. The third is, what will I learn? And what is the level of confidence that I have, right? So that's fundamentally looking at the knowledge, skills, and the attitude piece with respect to deploying the capability, be it anywhere across the globe. And this is the area which fundamentally post-COVID is getting a lot of importance and predominance, because they're actually going back to the aspect of confidence. A lot of the work around resilience, motivation, morale, etc., is emanating from that word, in this area that we get to see and hear from leaders, right? And the last three is around what's the level of applicability and instrument. So leaders ask about, or the discussions are around, what's the extent of use, what's the completion of the task, what are the enablers, most importantly, if you note, what are the barriers of use. So what's stopping you to deploy the capability? What resources do you need to deploy those capabilities? What's the level of use that you would require or foresee when you apply that, right? And how have you done it over a period of time? And then comes the impact and consequences. How is it, in terms of productivity, efficiency, satisfaction, engagement, et cetera, right? So that's another level. So, and the last one is the ROI. Often there is this whole business conversation on what's the ROI, fundamentally flawed. There is nothing called an ROI. It's a financial term, right? And there's nothing wrong with the term. It's just that when you're deploying it at enterprise capability, you have to chronologically look at what capability provides what level of conversation and output amongst the 5 levels that I talked about. It is not always that you have to go to a 5-level capability deployment. You can probably stop at a 3 or a 2 or a 1 for that matter. So different capabilities require a certain amount of discussion or a level of output, depending on the maturity, complexity, and the evolution of that particular capability. So this is a great tool for you to kind of look at get a sense as to where is this leader talking. Is he talking at that level 3 application implementation where I'm deploying, or is it talking about the impact consequence, or is he talking about that learning piece, or he's just worried about perceived value? Where is it? What space is he operating at? And if you ask me what are the discussions happening, these are the 5 clusters of discussion that get happen, right? So, and therefore, and this is just a real life example. How does it kind of so I've taken an example in HR. So, how does this framework imply in, something called return on learning? So you can actually use this framework to kind of, if you see on the right-hand side, the ROL scale parameter, you can actually do a return on learning tool around all these, right? And provide a much more comprehensive return on learning output basis those 6 levels that gets developed, right? Not all of the questions are relevant. You might choose some of them, not choose some of them, and you might stop at a certain level and say, hey, this is the maturity. But that's the best way to kind of look at what elements of these conversations gets translated or operationalized in different management systems, be it HR processes or management processes, right? So that's my last slide. I just want to skim through so these are some of the questions for applicability and use and so on. And therefore, how do you design a learning event value chain? So it's fundamentally, what's the issue? What's the sponsor? How do you do a need assessment? How do you do a learning event? And then introduce the return on learning to say that, hey, you know what is it that I'm gaining out of deploying that capability, and then execute the plan. So fundamentally the value chain around that learning event. Now, this is just an example. You can use that tool for any capability deployment that you want to do in forms, and trust me, the discussions with leaders would typically be in one of the 6 headlines that I just discussed. Right? So that's where I end, and I hope I've kept the time and did justice to that 15 minutes. Happy to take any clarifications or questions.
All right. Thank you so much for that presentation, Anjan. Very applied in terms of how these leadership styles can be actually brought to bear in terms of the enterprise capability or organizational capability. And we do have a number of questions coming in on the chat. I know I've only got about 30 minutes, right, Hardik? So let's go ahead and get them answered. So sure. I think, Taran, we've got a number of questions with regards to the other side of leadership, the negative side. I mean, how do you deal with these leaders positively, and whether or not the benign and malevolent followership reduces the organization's, I guess, in terms of performance. right? So how do you deal with them, in a positive way? And how do you actually, and do you think this kind of leadership, non-positive leadership, does have, negative consequences to the organization?
Okay, so I'm going to start with the first question. Thank you so much for all those very intriguing questions. I'm glad that it was inspiring enough to solicit some reaction from you all. So the first point is, how do you react positively to negative leadership? I think that depends a lot on the context and what is at stake. We have all encountered negative leadership, as I'm sure you've experienced yourselves, and also from what Dina said earlier, I can sense that this is not just my experience. So it depends on what is at stake. If it is something that is inconsequential at stake, you may let things pass, right? For example, in my own work, if somebody were to say, well, professors are required to teach 5 hours more in their workload, I wouldn't object necessarily to it, because that's part of what I am, that's part of what I do. Happy to meet with students for 5 hours more, fine. It doesn't solicit a strong reaction from me. But if someone were to say that you have to sacrifice your ethical values and do something that goes against your ethical standpoint, then your reaction would be much stronger. So there is obviously the question of how salient is the topic at hand. Assuming that things are difficult, assuming that the topic is salient and it does bother you, you have several tactics available to you. One of those tactics is persuasion, and persuasion can occur through a variety of different ways, depending on who your leader is, whom you're interacting with. Now, if your leader is a rational human being, you may persuade them by giving them data and statistics. You may persuade them by showing the outcome of certain decisions on the stakeholders affected by that decision. You may persuade them based on facts. But if leaders are less than rational, which also happens sometimes, then you might need other tactics, such as going above to the other level of the hierarchy, going to your boss's bosses, let's say. Now, this is a tactic that I would recommend with a lot of caution, but would I use it? Occasionally, yes. It's political, yes. Would I do it? If in the right direction, yes. There are disadvantages to this tactic. One of the disadvantages being that the trust that you have with your immediate leader, who is in question here, might take a hit in the process. But sometimes, if required, you might need to use this tactic. How you react to negative leadership also depends on how you position yourself as a follower. If you're a benign follower, well, obviously you would not react to negative leadership at all. But if you're a diehard, you take a much stronger standpoint. It depends a lot on what the issue is at stake and how you position yourself on that particular issue. And as I've said before, there are a couple of strategies available to us. For example, persuasion, showing facts, showing data, or going to the superiors. Or yet a third one could be to seek coalitions. Instead of going against them alone, you seek a group of people who will agree with you, who will sort of give support to your viewpoint, and you present a united front to a certain decision that the leader has taken, which you wish to oppose, as opposed to doing it alone. So there are a variety of strategies available for us to take a stand. And eventually, yes, the final option is for you to walk out. I'm not saying that is a strategy of choice, but that is always an option.
Right.
So I think that is what the first question was about.
Yep.
And seeing it from the...
Yeah, can I just kind of also loop Anjan into the second question, Taran, with regards to, well, we're talking about, the bad and the ugly side of leadership. How does that actually play, Anjan, in terms of building enterprise capability? I mean, is that something that can help build, or is that something that is, destructive?
Yeah, so thanks for that insight. So one of the things that comes out when when you deploy a capability at an enterprise level is, what's the current ecosystem of the firm that you're operating with? You cannot look at capability in isolation because it has to be deployed by a set of clusters of leaders or a set of followers, right? So one of the things that when you're looking at capability, what are some of the elements of enablements that you would like to devise? And one of the enablers is what ecosystem is getting generated. You have a situation when you have the bad and the ugly constituting bulk of your team, and you want to deploy a capability, it is set up for failure, right? So whatever capabilities that you want to deploy would be wished under the carpet because you're more, and I'm, you're more worried about the power and the politics of, to coin an OB term. So I think creating that enabling ecosystem to deploy a certain capability. And the enabling ecosystem does not necessarily means the type of leadership. It has different hosts. And that's where if you look at level 4 of that framework, it says what are the barriers that will prevent you to deploy that capability. So level 4 talks about barriers and headwinds. And that is where it features. You will probably have to have avenues where you discuss those barriers. So that would be my short response.
All right. And, but you have to, because I'm thinking about these questions too, and I'm thinking, is there a positive side, to having something that's kind of like a bad, ugly type of leadership? And I'm thinking, if we're in a crisis, right? Like right now we're in a crisis. And I'm living in the Philippines. We've been in lockdown for like forever. We haven't been allowed to go out freely. And it seems like a lot of people think that, being told to stay home is good, right? And so in that way, if you're in like extreme crisis and you really need everybody to just kind of follow and, is that something that can potentially be a good deployment of, that leadership style, Taran, do you think?
Yeah, there's increasing literature now, Dina, on the positive side of negative leadership, the positive outcomes of negative leadership, because as you can imagine, with increasing interest in negative leadership, the criticism of these forms of leadership has increased. And so obviously there are those who believe that this trend needs to be questioned. And one way of questioning it is to show that narcissistic leadership, for example, does produce positive consequences on organizational output. Or sometimes, and here I agree, that the perception of what is negative behavior might actually be misguided. You might have followers who perceive a certain leadership behavior as being negative, but in fact that behavior has a positive consequence for the organization. And in the same vein, there is also observation in external literature that talks about the fact that what we perceive as being neutral or even positive to us as followers is actually hidden negative behavior from leaders. You have all seen leaders who agree with you for everything, and you seem that you feel that you're in agreement with them, but then what happens concerning you is totally in a different direction. So there is this perceived positivity, but actual negativity. On the other hand, there could be perceived neutrality, but actual positivity as well. So perception of leadership is something that we need to study very, very carefully. And that's what we have done, Dina, in the project that I was mentioning earlier. It's all about perceived leadership from the follower's perspective. So yes, I think that there's increasing literature that talks about the positive consequences of perceived negative leadership. So yes, that can happen. Having said that, I think the focus is not so much on what is perceived as negative or positive leadership. The focus should be on the degree of power that followers take on themselves. My shift of focus is in that direction, that instead of constantly focusing on leadership, whether it's positive or negative, should we not be thinking about followership? Should we not be talking about under what conditions can followers strike a balance with leaders? Under what conditions can they challenge a certain practice, whether that is positive or negative in behavior, whether that is perceived or actual in behavior terms. And there, I think one of the questions becomes relevant. And that question is raised by Hemant, and he asks whether benign and malevolent followership is reducing as organizations are getting flatter. And my instinctive response to that question would be yes. Instances of benign and malevolent leadership might be decreasing. more proactive leadership, followership might be increasing in flatter organizations as in flatter societies. We've been watching what's happening around the world lately, and we've been seeing how social media and access to information has changed the name of the game in the past decades. So the fact that the world is becoming flatter due to a more democratization of information through social media, and that organizations, at least in certain parts of the world and in certain sectors of activity, are becoming flatter, that followers feel that they don't need to be benign, that they don't need to necessarily be malevolent, that they can raise their own opinions and challenge the status quo or challenge the dominant viewpoint.
Yeah.
So my instinctive reaction would be to say, yes, that is happening. However, I would add the disclaimer that this would change with different geographic contexts and different sectors of activity. This is not happening as much as we would like it to happen. People are not truly comfortable expressing their divergence of viewpoint as we would like them to. And they are not given the space to do so sometimes.
Okay. And I think, let me go ahead and pull us back. I think there's a good question with regards to the role of HR, because you also talked about, what is the effect on the followership, which technically is what, HR is all about, managing the people. And so Anjan, in terms of building these capabilities, what is the role that HR can play, and as well as to Taran, and in terms of these kinds of leadership styles, what is the role that HR needs to play in order to get the organization to become very effective?
So Anjali, great question. So one of the things that really needs to be done when you're looking at deployment of enterprise capability with leaders is ask the fundamental four questions that I talked about: where to play, how to win, what capabilities you need to do, and what processes and systems would you like to deploy, right? Now, when you ask that question, you will definitely lead the leader. I'm making practical applications here. You would lead the leader on thinking hard. Often, where to play, how to win is the easiest question to answer with leaders. What capability and process and systems always get shelves in most of my discussions that I have. So you need to actually push the leaders to say, hey, answer those four basic questions for me. You want to do this? What's the strategy? Where to play, how to win, what capabilities? And you push them to actually think hard on what capabilities would you lead. So that's the first thing. And once you have that set of inputs, you qualify that element of capability to say that, okay, now that you identified those four capabilities, are there any resources that you would lead? What are some of the barriers that you see? So go back to that 5-step model that I talked about. What are your headwinds? What are the things that you would like to do? What are the perceived value that you get out of that process, right? So it's a very, very linear, simple way. Push them to think hard on the strategy, make them answer those four questions, lead them to the capability, qualify it with the 5 angles that we are talking about, right? That's the first part. The second part is, what do we do when, situations that you talked about? I think one of the things that you should do as HR department would be, try to be a little more savvy on diagnostics, right? And I'll give you a quick example. In these, and Diana, you talked about these tough times, these COVID times. What was good as leadership is, before COVID, was when I have a one-on-one conversation with my team, I knew exactly what to speak. I had an agenda in my mind. I finished that item and I went back to my workstation. Now so that's good leadership. Now, when you go back to, as a leader having a one-on-one after COVID times, that entire thing changes to say, hey, in addition to what I want to discuss, I would also like you to tell me, I would like you to ask me, how am I feeling? Am I feeling okay? How's my health? How are you managing work from home? Is there anything I can help? So the entire paradigm of conversations changes from a task orientation to a task and a wellness orientation. And that's the difference between a good and a bad leadership. And bad is quite harsh a term, but a not so good leadership. But and therefore, you need to start doing those diagnostics to say, hey, change the narrative of the conversation. to kind of make sure that you have those two elements covered whenever you do these virtual catch-ups or when you do whatever catch-ups you want to do post-COVID. So that would be one quick yardstick to kind of follow.
All right, thank you, Anjan and Taran. I mean, what does HR have to, the role they play?
I think the way I would, the key word for me in answering that question would be training programs. And when you look at what has been happening in HR departments, well, in the corporate world and in specific sectors, is that the focus has always been on leadership training. And I call for a shift of focus. I call for a shift of focus from leadership to leadership and followership training. Because let's face the facts, not everyone is going to hold a position of leadership responsibility, organizational leadership responsibility at every stage of their career. But many of us will experience followership at some point in time or the other. So this excessive focus on leadership development as opposed to followership development, I think is somehow misguided by this romantic notion of leadership that we've had in the previous decades, where leadership is what everyone seeks. All our students today want to be future leaders. But what they will end up being for most part of their careers is good followers, and eventually at some point in time acquire leadership positions, if that is how they define leadership, that is. So my point is that there is a need to shift away from leadership development to also developing followership as a value-added concept. It's not necessarily that you're a follower because you fail to be a leader. You're a follower because you're at a specific stage in your career development where you can add value to your profile and to yourselves as human beings by being effective followers, by finding that to be an enriching experience. So followership is not when you fail to be a leader, is what I'm trying to say. Followership is a stage at which you find yourselves in your career and you can continue to add value. So developing followership, getting people to understand their traits, their characteristics, their behavioral tendencies as followers, getting them to understand the power that they hold through their engagement, through the voice that they have, through the power of dialogue, through the power of rational discussions, through the power of critical thinking, the ability that they have to convince other people, not just through Facebook and posting things on popular social media. That's not what I'm talking about. But I'm talking about the fact that you have the power, or most of us have the power to make our voices heard. And to undermine that would be to the discredit of the present and the future generation. So focusing on leadership as well as followership development. The other aspect I would focus on as an HR would be to offer training programs that talk about implicit leadership and implicit followership theories. And this follows from the research project that I was mentioning earlier on. What is implicit leadership theory and what is implicit followership theory? Now, each one of us has in our minds a certain prototype of what is a good leader and what is a good follower. So as a leader, I have in mind a picture, let's say, an imagined picture of what is a good follower. And as a follower, I have an image, a similar image of a leader in my mind. So that becomes my implicit leadership theory and the implicit followership theory that I hold as an individual. But when I see a certain behavior in a leader that matches my implicit theory, then I judge that leader positively. And when there is a misfit, I judge that leader negatively. And the same applies towards followers. But the clash occurs when my follower might have a different implicit leadership theory than myself. But it's only implicit, it's only perceived, it's only imagined. And therefore, there is a need for us as leaders to understand what is the implicit prototype that my follower carries of an ideal leader. And where does my behavior clash with that implicit? And when that clash occurs, what impact does it have? And how can I clarify? How can I generate a dialogue to resolve that clash? How can I make myself understood as a leader? So my implicit leadership theories, my implicit followership theories need to be explained. So what is implicit needs to be made explicit in these training programs. So there is a lot of scope for HR to make leadership and followership more active, let's say, or more meaningful, let's say, through these different kinds of training programs, is what I think. And I think that in a way, I'm sorry. Just very quickly, Diana, I think that in a way answers one or two questions that have been raised in the chat box. There are two questions, one by Harshita, I think, and another one.
Yes, about the fellowships. Yes. Thank you. I was going to say the same. And it really ties well to what Anjan is saying about building that capability. and the training is indeed a way to actually build the capability for followers, to find their power, right? I mean, it's not so much of just, kind of dealing with this toxic kind of leadership, is what you're saying.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Right. And so, I mean, so I hope our speakers were able to address a lot of those questions, even though they weren't directly being asked. But yes.
There's one by Gunika on how to make sure that the capabilities so developed contribute to ROI.
Yes, go ahead, Anjan.
So Gunika, to my point, don't be very over-assessed by the word ROI. Okay. I know the businesses thrust on us. And that's exactly my point. Whilst it is good to have a disposition around trying to find out the return, I would say the first thing that we should do around contribution to organization is first, what is the return on learning that we are giving? And then move to return on investments. The problem with businesses is businesses don't understand return on learning. They only understand the dollar value, right? And frankly, there is enough work across organizations. You can figure out that non-financial rewards also yields to productivity and efficiency. So show that data to them and tell them that, look, if you're looking at return or value creation based capability, we should definitely look at ROI. But if there is no way in which your capability is positioned to measure ROI, don't waste your sleep with that. And because there are different levels. There is perceived value, there is application, there is knowledge, skills, attitude. Let's talk that first, right? Because that indirectly contributes to creating value and capability, which definitely leads to giving you ROI. It's like asking a brand manager, hey, what is that advertisement costing you leads to value in dollar terms? I probably won't know that answer till kingdom come, right? So that's something that I would like to emphasize. And I'm not ever saying neglect ROI. What I'm trying to say that look at it holistically. Look at return on learning as a very key input to return on value creation, right? So that's the point I want to make.
And eventually return on investment. And
eventually return.
Right, and I like the focus on return on learning, Anjan, because that takes into account that we can fail, so technically, because you're learning, you can be allowed to fail rather than, having it right all the time, right? So really, what are we learning from this process is what we need to focus on. And, as we are winding down, I'd like to ask both of our speakers, any last thoughts to share with all our attendees right now with regards to the important role that HR needs to play in terms of what you had spoken to them about today. I mean,
if I may take the first word on this, I really liked what Anjan said a few minutes ago about the importance of learning and the return on learning as opposed to return on investment. I also liked in his presentation the use of the word resilience. I think that is key in everything we are talking about. Resilience, the ability to persevere, the ability to go through either situational, constraints or difficult leadership or toxic leadership. That I think is a very, very important quality. So along with resilience and the ability to learn and grow, agility, as I would call it, is also the ability to fail and accept failure without seeing it as a hubris of defeat, but seeing it more as a learning opportunity. That brings us back to what Anjan was saying. I think these are key terms. And while business schools, we teach our students a lot about return on investment, and we teach them a lot about performance and productivity and the like. The reality of life, on the other hand, has all these different experiences to it. It has the experience of failure. It has the experience of rejection. It has the experience of unexpected behaviors from bosses, to say the least, or shocking experience from leadership in the larger world, in the larger societal sense. But the clarity of thinking that is required, the ability to think critically through these different circumstances, the resilience to survive through these different circumstances, even if we fail sometimes, I think that is a key quality that we should be thinking about in our business school students. And that links in with a broader debate that we've been having over the years about what kind of education we are providing in business schools. What kind of leaders / followers are we producing in business schools? So I think I thank Hardik Bhai for giving us the space to express all of this. And it has been, from my side, a very enriching, from my perspective, a very enriching dialogue. Thank you, Anjan, for your very thoughtful, insightful presentation. Thank you.
No, thanks, Taran. And I think one of the things that Taran talked about is and I want to top it up with what Taran just said. It's again there is this data saying 70% of your management success post your formative years is attributed to how you face or how you are resilient in organizations. So it's 70% of your things are largely behavioral, how you manage those situations. The 30% that you go is fundamentally the tools and the capabilities that you bring in from these great institutions that you belong to. So I'm not going to touch that 70% because Taran just talked about it. I'm going to give you that 30% because then it probably completes the entire cycle. The most important thing that I think that you guys should really work, and I think the institution gives you, is the ability to work on diagnostics. One of the great ways to really consult leaders is to provide them information, not data. It's information, right? So therefore, it's important that you actually get the ability to, and this is the 30%, to get this the ability to build diagnostics and present it to whoever stakeholders that you work with. And I think one of the important things around is a lot of terminologies gets misspelled very, very loosely across corporate worlds. It's very, very clear that we really educate the businesses on certain terms that gets loosely spelled out. So this is a great opportunity to kind of polish. I gained a lot from this session. So thank you, Diana. Thank you for those enriching, provocative questions. Thank you, students. Thank you, Taran. A very, very insightful conversation. Thank you, Hardik, for all the work, and all the best to all of you when you walk out of your corporate life.
Absolutely, and thank you so much for this opportunity to have this discourse. Hardik, I'll go ahead and turn the floor to you and your students.
Then would you like to just summarize or something, add your points, one or two, and then maybe I will ask students to conclude. Will that be fine?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the two presenters did a really good job complementing each other's work. We had Taran talk through us with a lot of this theories around what leadership is, and really enlarging our understanding of what leadership can be, and like looking at not just the traditional ones, but what are those emerging ones, the not so sexy ones that we see and often we experience, but we don't really just kind of talk about, right? I mean, we have bad bosses, but we don't talk about those, right? But what she's saying is definitely we have a lot to learn about those things as well. And of course, Anjan talks about really how do we actually build these capabilities and the kind of tools that you need to have on your toolkit to be able to make this leadership qualities that you have to build on organizational capabilities and have a good conversation around how to get your company to where you want it to be, not just the kind of vision, but also in terms of the tactical aspect and what those capabilities are, which I think if you're a good leader, you would be able to actually make that clear, right? Those kinds of capabilities is what Anjan has been also emphasizing when it comes to applying and building this enterprise capability. Hardik?
Yeah, thank you, Professor Diana, Taran Ban and Anjan. I think it was wonderful insights in terms of like whether practice side of it, building it with the HR capabilities. I think I was also reading, I think recent one Harvard article, they are talking about creating complex capabilities for agile organization. I think that's maybe one of the few dimensions. They are talking about some 8 dimensions there. And I think you have summarized most of them in a different way based on your experiences and research studies that you have conducted for various organizations. So I thank you from bottom of my heart. I think it's interesting discussion, and I think we need to end it here. Students, over to you. Thank you.
Heartfelt gratitude to the chair of the session, Professor Diana Basil, and the speakers, Dr. Taran Patel and Dr. Anjan Bhowmick, for such an enlightening session. Thank you for your presence today, audience. We are officially ending the meeting for plenary session 1. Have a nice evening.